Robert Lancaster sat in front of a large mirror in his spacious bathroom. The soft glow of the lights fell gently on his face, highlighting the traces of fatigue that had built up over the past few years. He was 46, but sometimes he felt much older. Robert slowly ran his hand over the stubble that had grown over the past few days. Unusual for him. He always maintained a flawless appearance, but today he needed to look different. On the marble countertop next to the sink lay several tubes of foundation, concealer, and a makeup kit. Robert removed the lid from the foundation, squeezed a bit onto his fingers, and began to gently rub it into his skin, masking small imperfections. Then he took a dark eyebrow pencil and carefully traced the line of his brows, making them slightly thicker and more unkempt. The next step was his hair. Robert squeezed some gel onto his fingers and ran his hands through his hair, giving it a tousled look. His usually neatly slicked back hair now looked as if he'd just rolled out of bed. He picked up a pair of scissors and trimmed a few strands at his temples. A little unevenness gave the look more authenticity. Next, he opened the closet and pulled out an old gray sweatshirt and worn jeans. The clothes were clean, but looked like they'd been worn for years. He slipped on a pair of simple sneakers that were already starting to wear out. To finish off the look, Robert put on a black baseball cap, pulling it low over his eyes. His reflection in the mirror no longer resembled a successful businessman. Now he looked like an ordinary man, a little tired of life. He returned to the bedroom and took his leather wallet from the table. Inside were a few credit cards and some cash. Robert opened a hidden pocket and pulled out a driver's license. He'd ordered a new one under a fake name in advance. The document read, Robert Livermore. Robert sat on the edge of the bed, ran his hands over his face, and sighed. He had thought about this decision for a long time. The store was his pride. He had built it from scratch, investing all his savings and years of hard work into it. At first, everything went great. Customers praised the service, employees were happy, and profits were growing. But over the past 6 months, things had changed. Complaints about rude staff, delivery delays, and suspicious cash shortages had started coming in. Regular customers began turning to competitors. Robert had tried to figure it out, speaking with the managers, but the answers were always the same. We're working on it. Yet nothing was changing. His intuition told him that the problem ran much deeper. So he decided to check it out himself. But not as the owner, as a regular customer. If someone was really sabotaging the store's operation, he would only be able to spot it from the inside. Robert stood up and looked in the mirror one last time. Determination reflected in his eyes. He grabbed his car keys and took a deep breath. Time to find out the truth, he muttered under his breath and walked out of the apartment. Robert parked a block away from his store. He had chosen this spot intentionally. He didn't want any of the staff to recognize his car. Sitting behind the wheel, he briefly rested his hand on the keys in the ignition. His heart was beating faster than usual. It was funny. It was just his store. He had been here hundreds of times. But this time, everything felt different. He took a deep breath, grabbed a simple black backpack from the passenger seat, and got out of the car. There was a faint scent of rain in the air from a recent shower, and the asphalt underfoot was slightly damp. Robert pulled his baseball cap lower over his eyes and walked briskly toward the store. When the automatic doors opened, he was hit by a familiar sensation. The smell of fresh bread from the bakery, the faint aroma of coffee from the coffee machine near the checkout, the sound of the scanner at the register occasionally beeping. The store looked just as it always did, but this time, Robert saw everything through different eyes, like an outsider observing. He walked past the shelves, observing the employees. Behind the cash register stood a young girl with a dark ponytail, who didn't even notice him. She was chewing gum and looking at her phone while the customer in front of her struggled to pay with a card. Near the fridge with drinks, a young man in the store's branded t-shirt was leaning against a shelf. He was clearly slacking off, chatting with a colleague who who held a bottle of water in her hand. They didn't even notice when a customer with a basket walked past them. Robert picked up a basket and headed toward the fruit section. He grabbed a few apples and tossed them into a clear bag. Next to him stood an elderly woman carefully inspecting some grapes. She glanced up at Robert and gave him a faint smile. He nodded in response and moved on. In the dairy section, Robert stopped by the row of yogurts and overheard two employees talking behind him. "Hey, did you see the register was off again?" one of them, a red-haired guy, said. "Forget about it," the other replied. "The manager won't do anything anyway." Robert just keeps texting his managers, but nothing ever changes. "You think he even notices?" "Doubt it," the second guy laughed. Lately, the store's been running on autopilot. Robert pretended he hadn't heard anything and slowly walked away. His heart tightened. He had suspected that things weren't right in the store, but hearing it from his own employees, that hurt. He approached the register, placed his items on the conveyor belt, and looked up at the cashier. It was Julia. She had been working for him for over 2 years. Robert had always considered her responsible, but now she looked like she couldn't care less about her job. 7:45, she muttered, not even looking up from her phone. Robert pulled a bill from his wallet and placed it on the counter. "Thanks," he said quietly. Julia didn't even look at him. She stuffed the money into the register and went back to her phone. Robert left the store, walking a few steps along the sidewalk. His hands were clenched into fists. He had expected to see some problems, but this was worse than he thought. His employees had grown complacent, and the store's atmosphere was poisoned by indifference. A loss of discipline. That's what he had seen with his own eyes. He sat down on a bench near the store, opened the bottle of water he had bought, and took a few sips. His thoughts were racing. Restoring order wouldn't be easy. It would mean conflict, maybe even firing some staff. But Robert knew it had to be done if he wanted to save his business. "First, I need to figure out exactly who's undermining the discipline," he muttered under his breath. His gaze settled on the young man standing near the store entrance, chatting with a girl in a uniform. The guy looked far too relaxed, hands in his pockets, a smug smile on his face. Robert tipped his hat higher on his forehead and decided to start with him. Robert watched the boy for a few more minutes. The boy leaned toward the girl, said something, and she laughed. Then he pulled out his phone, replied to a message, and, still smiling, walked toward the stockroom. The girl lingered by the entrance for a moment before returning to the register. Robert stood up from the bench and followed the boy. He kept his distance to avoid suspicion. The boy entered the staff door near the produce section, and Robert quietly followed him. A narrow hallway led to the stockroom. The room was cool, with a faint smell of cardboard and plastic wrapping. The boy leaned down to a large box of products and pulled out a bottle of soda. Then, glancing over his shoulder, he opened the bottle and took a few sips. Robert frowned. That was a violation of the rules, but the boy didn't even bother to hide it. "Good taste, huh?" Robert said suddenly, stepping forward. The boy flinched, turned around, and saw Robert, an older man in a cap and cheap clothes. His eyes narrowed. "Who are you?" the boy asked bluntly. "I'm new here," Robert replied, smiling. "I don't think we've met." The boy studied him carefully, then took another sip from the bottle. "New, huh? Then you'd better stay out of things that don't concern you." Robert kept smiling, but anger was boiling inside him. He took a step forward. "Do you often take drinks straight from the stockroom?" The boy shrugged. "No one notices if a bottle or two goes missing. Besides, nobody pays attention to small things like that around here." "And the manager doesn't notice?" "The manager doesn't care about anything," the boy replied smugly. "You can do whatever you want in this store, as long as you don't get caught." Robert stepped closer, his eyes narrowing. "And what if you do get caught?" The boy smiled again. "So what? Fire me? I'll find another job in a day." Robert stared at him silently. That arrogance, that sense of impunity, This was exactly why the store's discipline was falling apart. But the boy was wrong if he thought this would go without consequences. "What's your name?" Robert asked. "Travis," the boy replied, raising his chin. "Travis." Robert nodded. "I'll remember that name." He turned and slowly walked toward the exit. Travis watched him with his head slightly tilted. "See you around, old man," Travis called after him. Robert left the stockroom and walked through the store toward the exit. On the way, he noticed more troubling signs. The cashier, Julia, was once again looking at her phone instead of serving customers. A stock clerk was leaning against a shelf, typing on his phone, and customers were wandering between the aisles, looking confused by the poorly organized merchandise. This wasn't just a discipline issue. This was chaos. And Robert knew he couldn't let it continue. He stepped outside and sat on the bench. His heart was pounding. One thought kept running through his head. It was time to take back control of this store. He pulled out his phone, opened his contacts, and tapped his manager's number. "Peter," he said when the call was answered. "Call a staff meeting tomorrow morning. We've got serious problems, and I'm going to fix them." He put the phone back in his pocket and looked at the store again. In the evening light, it looked the same as always. But Robert knew, after tomorrow, everything would be different. The next morning, Robert woke up at 6 a.m. He drank a cup of strong black coffee, put on a dark blue suit, and fastened a silver watch on his wrist, a gift from his former business partners. Looking in the mirror, he didn't see an old man, but an experienced entrepreneur who knew how to handle business. Today, he was no longer an undercover customer. Today, he was returning as the owner. At 7:30 a.m., Robert walked into the store. The employees had already started gathering in the staff room for a meeting. He walked past the registers, noticing that Julia was once again looking at her phone, and there was a torn apple package on the shelf near the vegetables. No control whatsoever. Peter, the store manager, met him at the entrance to the storage room. He was a tall man in his 40s, wearing a light-colored shirt that was already starting to wrinkle. Worry was written all over his face. "They're all in the meeting room," Peter said, nervously rubbing his hands. "Robert, maybe it's better if—" "No," Robert replied coldly. "We need discipline." He opened the door to the room. Inside were about 20 employees, cashiers, stock clerks, and shelf organizers. They were sitting on plastic chairs, chatting and joking with each other. When Robert entered, the voices gradually died down. He walked to the front of the room and looked at everyone. His gaze lingered on Travis, who was leaning back in his chair, arms crossed, with a slight challenge in his eyes. "Good morning," Robert began in an even voice. "My name is Robert Grayson. I'm the owner of this store, and I'm here to restore order." Silence fell over the room. A few people exchanged uneasy glances. "I've had the chance to observe your work from the sidelines," he continued, "and what I saw did not satisfy me. Lack of discipline, carelessness, indifference toward customers and store rules. It's all unacceptable." He took a step forward and looked directly at Travis. "For example, I've noticed that some employees help themselves to products without paying. Some of you might think that's a minor issue, but that's theft. And from this moment on, it will no longer be tolerated." Travis pressed his lips into a thin line, but didn't look away. "I'm going to implement new rules," Robert went on. "First, every employee must arrive for their shift 10 minutes before work starts. No more lateness. Second, phone use during work hours is prohibited unless you're on a break. Third, all products must be properly displayed and checked daily. If any product is damaged or expired, notify the manager immediately." "Is this some kind of military camp?" Travis muttered, leaning forward. Robert gave him a cold stare. "If you don't like it, the door's over there." Travis clenched his jaw, but stayed silent. "Fourth," Robert continued, "any rule violations will be recorded. First offense, warning. Second, fine. Third, termination." A few people shifted nervously in their chairs. "And one more thing," Robert's gaze swept over the employees. I'm going to increase wages for those who perform well. I know there are employees here who give their best, and they will be recognized. Several people perked up with interest. But those who slack off need to understand that I won't turn a blind eye anymore. If anyone thinks these rules are too strict, you can leave right now. He fell silent and watched the employees. For a few seconds, there was tense silence. Then one of the cashiers, a dark-haired girl named Sarah, raised her hand. I think it's fair, she said. Things really have gotten out of control here. A few people nodded. Good, Robert said. Peter will prepare a detailed list of the new rules and send it to you. For now, get back to work. He turned to Peter. Peter, stay for a minute. When everyone left, Robert approached the manager. Keep a close eye on Travis. If there are any more issues, report directly to me. Understood, Peter nodded. Robert left the meeting room and walked toward the registers. Julia was once again looking at her phone. Julia, Robert said quietly. She looked up, startled, and quickly shoved her phone into her pocket. Sorry, Mr. Grayson. Don't apologize, he said gently. Just do your job. He surveyed the store, noticing that the employees had started moving more briskly. A new worker was arranging apples neatly in a row in the produce section. A few customers were already walking between the shelves, and this time they didn't look confused. Robert felt that familiar sense of control rising in his chest. The foundation had been laid. He stepped outside, inhaled the crisp air, and smiled. This was only the first step, but he knew he was taking his store back under his control. The next morning, Robert arrived at the store before it opened. He sat in his office, reviewing reports from the last 3 months. Sales figures were unstable, but the main problem wasn't the products or the prices, it was the staff. Indifference, negligence, lack of discipline. All of it was destroying the store from within. He set the papers aside and looked through the window into the sales floor. A few employees were already standing near the registers, lifelessly scrolling through their phones. From the storage room, he could hear a loud crash. Someone was clearly handling the boxes carelessly. Robert felt his anger boiling inside him. This had to stop. Now. He picked up the phone and pressed the internal line. Gather everyone in the sales floor in 5 minutes, he said coldly. 5 minutes later, the entire staff had gathered on the sales floor, cashiers, sales assistants, stockroom workers. Some stood with their arms crossed, others leaned lazily against the shelves. Travis was there too, standing with a smug smile on his face. Robert stepped into the center of the room. He removed his glasses, wiped them, and slowly looked at each person. I see a lot of familiar faces here, he began in a quiet but confident voice. And a lot of problems. A few people exchanged glances. Last week, I spent more time in this store than I have in the past year, Robert continued. And I've seen enough to understand one thing. This store isn't working because of you, it's working despite you. Silence fell over the room. Theft from the stockroom, rudeness to customers, constant lateness. Robert shot a glance at Travis, who immediately straightened up. Lack of discipline. These aren't just mistakes, they're a complete disregard for the job. And I won't tolerate it any longer. He took a step forward. That's why I've made a decision. He swept his gaze across the room. Everyone who worked in this store before today is fired. Whispers broke out in the crowd, followed by loud laughter from someone. Are you serious? Travis stepped forward. You can't fire everyone at once. Robert looked at him with an icy smile. I can. And I already have. And who's going to work instead of us? Travis challenged. You think you can find a whole new staff in a single day? Robert stepped closer. I already have. The doors opened, and a group of people entered, young, fit men and women dressed in new uniforms. They lined up in a semicircle behind Robert. This is the new team, Robert said. Professionally trained, motivated, and ready to start right now. Travis's expression darkened. "Is this some kind of game?" he growled. "I've worked here for 3 years. You can't just throw me out like this." Robert stepped up to them, their faces only inches apart. "I not only can," Robert said quietly, "I have to." Travis clenched his fists, but Robert didn't break eye contact. "Leave your keys at the counter," Robert added, "and get out of my store." Travis stared at him for a moment, then angrily threw his badge on the floor. "You'll regret this," he hissed, turned, and stormed out of the store. Robert looked at the rest of the staff. "If anyone wants to leave with him, this is your chance." A few people glanced at each other, but no one moved. "Good," Robert said. "Your paperwork will be ready by the end of the day." He turned to the new team. "We're starting now. Jane, take control of the registers. Michael, check the shelves. Sarah, head to the stockroom. You know what to do." "Yes, sir," Jane replied, heading toward the registers. Robert watched as the new team quickly dispersed to their stations, and a sense of satisfaction grew inside him. He had regained control, and this was only the beginning. Travis stood by the exit, holding his badge in his hand, but he wasn't in a hurry to hand it over. His face was red with anger, and his jaw was tightly clenched. "You can't just kick me out like this," he repeated, his voice shaking with rage. Robert slowly approached him, stopping just one step away. The whole room held its breath. "I can, and I will," Robert replied coldly. "But first, we need to discuss something." Robert suddenly grabbed the badge from Travis's hand and held it up in front of his face. "You've worked here for 3 years, and in that time you've managed to cause more harm than good," he said, his voice steady but with fire burning in his eyes. "Neglecting your job, bullying new employees, stealing from the stockroom. You think I didn't notice?" Travis's fist tightened. "You have no proof." Robert smiled. "Oh, I have more proof than you'd like," he said, nodding toward the security guard by the entrance. "Show him." The guard pulled out a tablet and started a video from the security cameras. On the screen, clear footage showed Travis taking a box from the stockroom and stuffing several items into his backpack. Then the scene changed. Travis was standing by the register, smirking and rolling his eyes as a new employee struggled to scan an item. "This is fake," Travis shouted. "This is reality," Robert answered firmly. "And you're about to face the consequences." Travis tried to take a step back, but Robert grabbed his shoulder. "I could have just fired you," Robert said. "But you went too far. You didn't just harm the business. You hurt people, humiliated them, and abused your position. That won't go unpunished anymore." Robert glanced at the guard. "Get him out of here," and called the police. Travis's eyes widened in horror. "The police? You're crazy." "I'm not crazy." Robert stepped closer until they were face to face. "You just thought you could get away with it." The guard seized Travis's arm and started dragging him toward the exit. "I'll be back," Travis shouted, struggling to break free. "I doubt it," Robert replied coolly. The doors closed behind Travis. The room remained tense and silent. All eyes were on Robert. He scanned the room with a sharp gaze. "Back to work," he said shortly. The new team dispersed without hesitation, each person heading to their station. Robert stood in the center of the room, feeling a deep sense of calm rising within him. He had finally taken control, and now everything would change. After Travis was escorted out of the store, Robert remained standing in place for a few more seconds, taking deep breaths. His eyes still held a cold calmness, but inside, everything was gradually settling down. It took him a few minutes to collect himself, but he knew this wasn't just a fight with Travis. It was a fight for the dignity of every one of his employees. A few staff members glanced at him discreetly, as if trying to gauge whether he would treat them differently now. Robert sighed and raised his hands, as if trying to ease the tension in the room. "Listen," his voice was warmer than it had been a few minutes ago. "I understand that many of you are going through a difficult time, but we have to work together to make this place better." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. "I know that change will be hard, but I promise you, no more abuse. No one will work without respect. We need to be a team, not a group of people competing against each other." Robert turned toward Megan, who was standing by the register, and saw her eyes widen slightly in surprise. "Megan, do you want to work here?" Megan nodded, looking a bit embarrassed, but feeling a sense of relief. "Yes, I do." "Good. You're on the right track. This is your team. We all work together." Robert looked at the rest of the staff, each of whom now seemed more willing to shift their attitude toward work. "I know things won't be perfect right away, but we'll work on it together," he said, smiling slightly. "And I'm ready to support you. You're not alone." Those who had looked at Robert with doubt just a few minutes ago now saw in him not just a boss, but someone who genuinely wanted to change things for the better. Robert returned to his desk without saying another word. His mind was already turning over thoughts about the next steps, the reforms and changes he needed to put in place. He knew there was still a lot of work ahead, but what happened today was the first step. And even though his journey was only beginning, Robert felt that this small step could be the start of something big. He was ready to face any challenges. And even if it wouldn't be easy, he was prepared to lead his team through these changes. And maybe even these simple steps would make a difference.